Backed up my diary just because I've got Kate's in a mess and
Very much.
Good day, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are almost exactly on time. We're just waiting for a couple more attendees to join, and then we will kick off. Geez, it looks like we've got a fantastic turnout for a compliance presentation, which is surprising, but good.
Yeah.
All right, we're just on 12. We'll probably give it another minute or so, and then we'll kick off. Welcome to those who've just joined. Got Dean's hand up. Dean?
Morning, guys. Sorry, I clicked the wrong icon there. It's just
No.
clapping hands, thumbs up, one of these reactions, not my raise hand. Sorry.
No problem at all. Good to have you with us. Right, what are we up to, Mel? I see there. Give it another 30 seconds or so. Right, we are at 12:01. We are very conscious of everyone's time, and we obviously have a very short session today in the Bytes and Bytes. So I think we are going to kick off. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Bytes and Bytes session in partnership with Microsoft and Argantic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Timperley. I'm the Chief Executive at Turrito. I'm joined today by Gary Ackerman. Gary is the founder of Argantic, who will be taking us through a brief presentation on compliance with Microsoft Purview. Now, compliance is normally considered a bit of a buzzkill in organizations, albeit a necessary one. But I once heard someone give the best explanation around the importance of compliance, which is that it is where fun goes to die, but it's also where lawsuits go to die. So it's certainly very well worth it. We're going to try and keep these sessions very short and sweet, so please make a note of any questions that you have during the session, and we'll have a brief Q&A at the end of the session to cover any of the questions that you have. Please also enjoy the lunch vouchers that you got. Hopefully you've already ordered and have it in front of you so you can enjoy that during the presentation. And therefore, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just doing a sound check. Can you guys hear me?
We got you.
I live in the George area, everybody. Good day. And we've had an incredible amount of rain since midnight last night, which sometimes impacts the bandwidth. So if I disappear for whatever reason, please just let me know somehow. I'd like to try and keep talking to you as long as I possibly can before there's any sort of interruption. But we do have some infrastructure-related issues from time to time when it rains as much as it did last night. Anyway, we're grateful for the water. We see other parts of the country could use it. And if we could, we'd send it in your direction. But until we got that technology in play, let's deal with the technology in front of us. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you've, as Brian said, you've got your vouchers and you're enjoying a bite on us. And we'll hopefully give you a couple more bites of information and knowledge by the time this is finished. When I was talking to the team about getting this presentation together, we debated the idea of getting into the feature set around Purview itself, but we kind of concluded that anybody can go and watch the intro videos that are available, and there's plenty of them available. If you want us to share that with you, we can do that after the case. We'll get into some of the features itself, but this is not a Purview feature demonstration session at all. It's about us sharing with you some strategies that have worked for us in other organizations, and in the 10 and 20 years that we've been doing this, we've learned certain tricks and of the trade and strategies that you need to implement in order to make this type of deployment successful. So we're going to share a little bit more about that and deal with some of the foundational elements of Purview itself. We're going to have quite a bit of time at the end for any sort of Q&A. So I'd ask if you got any questions, please send them through. Mel and the team will be making sure that we get to those right at the end. We'll obviously attempt to deal with anything right now, but in some cases, answering your question might need a sort of direct engagement, and we'll certainly reach out to you to make sure that those get answered. So let's get the party started. And by party, I mean, as Brian said, where fun goes to die. So just as a little bit of an experiment, I asked Copilot to give me some definitions around risk and compliance. And I got compliance is not a burden. It's a foundation of trust and the key to sustainable success. So I then said to Copilot, well, give me another one. And it said, well, compliance is a bridge between chaos and order, ensuring that integrity and accountability are always in place. And then I gave it, I think, 3 additional words. I said, make it sassy. And it delivered this peach. Compliance, because nothing says trust like a mountain of paperwork and endless audits, which is pretty accurate for most of our experiences around this. But, we don't want to dwell too much on the negative side of this, and we want to talk to you about how to best get this deployed. So let's start dealing with the process first, and then we'll get into more product-specific stuff that Microsoft can deliver through the Purview product. We've got to deal with the why part of this equation first. And I think one of the graphs that I found from the IDC that illustrates this quite well is this one. If you go back to 2010, the estimated total of volume of data created and replicated throughout the world is 2 zettabytes. Now, I wonder if anybody can tell me how many zeros are after the 1 in a zettabyte. Brian? No prizes if you're inside Turrito, by the way.
I believe it's 21, Gary.
That is correct. 21 zeros, guys. So the volume of data that we're talking about here has gotten to the point where the simplistic tools that we use, and if you go back to 2010 and before, you're talking about your protection mechanism and your classifications were very simplistic. So your data sat on a file server somewhere, or maybe in a database. You use the file folder names and/or file names to provide you with metadata elements, and your access control was based on where the data was located, and that's kind of how you protected stuff, and you knew what was there. Fast forward to what they're projecting for next year, which is 181 zettabytes of data, and it's very obvious that the simplistic tools and mechanisms that we used in the past are no longer sufficient for dealing with the ever evolving world of compliance and data loss protection and access control and data classification and standards alignment. One of the elements of compliance is not just with regulatory, but also with standards alignment. So when I went and, over the years started to look at all the different tools that were available, and what I found was that the process involved in making sure something like this works is essentially the same, regardless of what tool you're actually using. And the starting point, it's something it's always quite strange. When I meet with customers and I sit with normally it's the IT department or the IT team, and I say to them, okay, so what data are we talking about? And everybody will kind of look at you with a strange face going, of course we know where our data is. And this is typically followed in the next 10 minutes with, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And oh yeah, is that still on? And it becomes clear that the exercise of defining where your data is not actually something that most IT departments have done as a formal process. So when it comes to this type of project, your very first step is, where is your data and what is your data? So that the step involves in defining, and you're going to hear this being referred to quite a lot, by the way. All compliance tools now refer to a thing called a data estate. And essentially what they're just saying is a boundary that you put around all the data that you have. Then what you've got to do is you've got to classify that data. So it's not just good enough to know where your data is, you need to know what it is. That is very, very important. The next step is to implement a monitoring and auditing process. Now, a lot of people say, but hang on, isn't this something you just implement at the end to make sure that your project was a success? No, it isn't, because essentially, as you roll out a policy framework in the next step, you need to make sure that it's effective, and you can't do it after it's done. You need to do it as it's in process. So step 2 is implement a monitoring and auditing process as part of your deployment. Then I've already alluded to what the next step would be, and that is define your policy framework and enforcement mechanisms. So essentially, once you've classified your data, you now need to put policies together, make sure that the data is protected and that you meet the regulatory and/or standards that have been set by whatever framework you are trying to comply with. The 4th step is risk identification and mitigation, or just generally called risk management. So once you know what your data is and where it is, you can now start talking about access controls and using your policies to ensure that data doesn't leave your organization when it's not supposed to, and what processes are in place to protect data in its different modes of transportation or rest. So these are risk mitigation and or management strategies that you would put in place. The 5th step is to implement your reporting and documentation. One of the outputs of almost all compliance exercises is to provide evidentiary proof of execution. In fact, it's probably the whole purpose of this, is to provide that documentation so that you will survive an audit. In the past, what used to happen was the auditors used to arrive at a company and kind of conduct their audit and give you a finding list, and then you'd have a certain amount of time to be able to execute against that. In the modern world, nobody's got time for that. You need to be able to provide the auditors with the proof that you've met all the requirements that are required to execute against the compliance framework that you're trying to align with. And that will actually make your life a whole lot simpler. And the last step, in light of all of this, is to provide and implement and maintain and manage an ever-evolving data encryption and protection framework based on everything that you've conducted to this point. This is where what you call the rubber meets the road. IT deployment tasks come out of the process and gets implemented. So policies for mobile devices or any sort of device that is accessing the data, any edge frameworks that are in place, protection environments, or as our team is now colloquially started to calling, or casually started to call it, how do you raise the fences on your data estate? So those, from a 6-step process, is typical what will happen with regardless of what tool you're using and whatever process you're going to be using. Those are all very important steps. Now, before we get into the specifics around Purview, one of the things that we've got to highlight, and regardless of what tool that you're actually using, is that there is no silver bullet that is going to solve or guarantee the protection of your data in a data state. And this is something we have quite a lengthy conversation with almost every either legal and or standards-based entity or department within a company, is that no framework will guarantee anything. But from a legal perspective, what you're looking for is to show that you did everything reasonably rational to protect information or to meet the requirements of whatever standard you were applying to. As standards and threats evolve, the tools and processes that you implement need to do the same thing. But everybody is fully aware of the fact that there are no guarantees in play. But that shouldn't stop the effort of continually evolving and making sure that you've done your level best or rational or reasonable best to implement whatever you need to protect people's information, people or key information within your organization. So with that said, let's start dealing with the product on show today, and that is Microsoft Purview. And as I said, I'm not going to get into a feature for feature demonstration today or presentation. What I'm going to deal with is the very basics of what Purview is. Now, for those of you, some of you may be familiar with a product called Compliance and Risk Center in Microsoft. That's essentially what Purview is replacing. But it's replacing it by ingesting that portal and a bunch of other tools. And Microsoft has then created a whole bunch of additional tools that are now part of what they call Microsoft Purview. So as a very short answer, Purview is a collection of tools. It's not one thing. And you use those tools, and there's new tools being added all the time to achieve your data security and governance processes and objectives. So from a pure product perspective, it is there to help you drive those outcomes. And you'll see, I'm going to give you a little bit of an indication of some of the reports and dashboards that it gives to you. But you are able during the process to upload the templates of the governance and or standards that you want to meet. And in some cases, it will automatically show you what aligns, but it will also give you whatever manual steps from a audit perspective you need to conduct in order to meet those obligations as well. So from a framework perspective, it's excellent. It does some of the job for you, and the rest just gives you a very nice place for you to be able to collect the information so that when audit time comes along, it's really, really simplified. I've got some of my team with me today. So later on, if you want specific questions or you want to find out something about some of the projects that we've done in the past, they'll be able to assist us with some of those answers. From an implementation perspective, Microsoft is very clear. It aligns with those 6 steps that I spoke about earlier. They've got a mechanism for identifying your data estate. And it also then takes you through the process of labeling and classifying your data. These are two very important steps, and it provides you with mechanisms to do that. Excuse me, just having a sip. The next part of the process is then to align your policies with the classifications itself, and then to access the reporting that's available to you. And as a bit of an example, when you start out, you're going to get this type of report. Now, this doesn't belong to any customer, by the way. This is Microsoft's demo type pictures. I wouldn't really share anybody else's information. It would be, I think, a major governance violation if I had to do that. But anyway, here's an example of the type of things that you get. So in this case, it's showing you some of the what percentage of your data has been classified, and some of the activities around those data estates, identifying the data estates and the classification activities that need to take place and where you are in your journey. A second report or dashboard that you get will give you a little bit more insight as to where your data sits. And in some cases, it'll show you that the assets have been classified correctly in some places, how much data you've got sitting in different areas. Just gives you a very nice view as to where all your data is actually sitting. And then the last one is, further classification. Now, these reports are still fairly rudimentary in our view. That they'll give you a lot of the basic information that you're wanting. But what we're finding is that they're evolving, and every month we're seeing more and more of these reports being added to this portal, so that as Purview evolves as a product and an activity within a business, so does the reporting capability. So it's fairly useful in that sense. So from a product perspective, that's what it does. And you'll see that the Microsoft Beyond the Risk and Compliance portal that used to exist on a SharePoint platform, they've now included eDiscovery, and they've now got a new version of eDiscovery called eDiscovery Premium, which is in preview under Purview. Say that 20 times. They have a lot of other things that they are starting to incorporate, by the way. So you'll see this collection of tools is growing rapidly as time goes on. What Microsoft is also doing is including things to connect to other data sources. So Microsoft has got a stated ambition of being able to identify and interact with your data regardless of where it is. So if you're interested in that, just go and have a look at the connectors that are available. So Brian, you just asked a question, is eDiscovery and Purview the same thing? eDiscovery is part of Purview. It's one of the tools that now sits in the Purview collection of tools. Moving on, now let's deal with the strategies itself and some of the advisory things that we can tell you from our experiences. Probably the most important exercise you're going to undertake is what Microsoft calls in fancy words, they say, define your data estate. It's more than that, actually, because it's finding your data where it is. and defining, just making sure you know where your data is. Quite simple. But we have an extra part of that sentence that we would like to reiterate, and that is, or to advise, and that is, where reasonably possible, migrate that data to the cloud. Most vendors of these tools will have a little tick box next to on-premise capability. But to be honest with you, it is very limited. Most of the tools that you're engaging with are going to tell you what data you have and where it's at, but that's about where it stops. The policy enforcement will come to a point of saying, well, the policies need to be applied, but can't be because there's no interaction between a legacy on-prem environment and the Purview and or other tool that you're using. So what we have found is that by far, to get the most bang for your buck from a compliance tool mechanism, make sure your data, where reasonably possible, is in the cloud. That is a very key starting point that we would recommend. The next step, the next piece of advice we would give you is, and something that we encounter all the time, is when the IT department is tasked with implementing a solution of this nature, and as Brian has said, this is the type of project, unfortunately, that is dealt with the least amount of enthusiasm in our experience, is don't get too restrictive in one go. You will paralyze your organization. We have dealt with customers that went and said, just tell us which policies we need to implement and we'll switch them on and we'll get on with life. And the next thing you find that your users can't access what they need to, or you've got to go through the process of making sure things are classified properly. You know, there is a default setting in a lot of these tools that if things are unclassified, that they immediately become inaccessible. So that type of stuff is what we would say is to avoid. Go through the process of implementing one rule at a time, and don't get too fancy with your classifications. 3, if you can get away with 3 levels of classification, 4 if you absolutely need it. Anything more than that, you're creating hell for yourself. And then your policy framework, which actually multiplies by that number, becomes less restrictive or less complicated, let's put it that way, and a lot easier to understand and implement. So advice from a strategy perspective, try not to be too restrictive in one go. Allow your policy framework to evolve and be implemented in a reasonable time frame that is not going to overwhelm your user base. And then comes what we refer to as the elephant in the room. Compliance is absolutely not a sexy topic at all. And I've tried to come up with an analogy, and between myself and a bunch of my friends, we all have teenage kids. And the equivalent is explaining to your kids the importance of cleaning their room and then trying to get them to do it. The only way it works is where there are consequences when it doesn't happen. And that, unfortunately, is what we've got to present as our third strategic advice, or advice to making sure that this gets implemented. And we've actually been advised by a lot of practitioners in the audits of compliance frameworks that it's a requirement that there is a proper consequence management as part of the framework or part of the audit to ensure that standards are implemented correctly. So it brings up the case of, what happens if users just stop classifying documents, or if they willfully classify something incorrectly just to try and make their life a little easier. You need to rope in management across the board to make sure that there are consequences for users that do this. It is an unpleasant topic. It's not something, we've tried to follow in the early days, a lot of the vendors used to give us sort of motivational things to try and enthuse user bases. None of them worked. The only semi-effective approach or effective approach that we've seen is where management gets serious with the user base, explains to them the consequence of not following the protocols and the rules and not adhering to the policies, and then following through on the consequences if it happens. As I said, it's not a sexy topic, and it does come with it basically needs to come with teeth. Colin and I, when we were setting up this presentation, by the way, had a little bit of a generational awareness moment when we tried to explain to Melanie and Jessica what the whole carrot versus a stick concept was. Neither of them understood what that was. So I had to explain to everybody that, to try and get a donkey to move, you can either offer it a carrot or a stick. In this case, you're dealing with the same thing. And the only solution to this and the only strategy to implement, unfortunately, is a stick. The fourth element that from a strategy that I need to implement is, or that I recommend, is your compliance management or purview deployment process and management and maintenance needs to be an ongoing process. This is not something that you can kind of say, well, we met the requirements in 2023. When we measure ourselves against the new standards in 2024, we automatically, or it's just going to be a couple of things that we have to sort out. Those days are over. We are seeing from the templates that are evolving, you've got like version 1, version 2, version 3, and they're coming all the time. There's new laws, new regulations, new standards, new industry standards that are being implemented, privacy laws all over the place. These things are coming all the time. And when you try and deal with them as a project, it's overwhelming. But if you do it as a regular cadence within your business, it becomes a lot easier to eat this elephant. And that's something that we would recommend everybody looks at. When you go down the Purview road, just make sure you review it on a regular basis, once a month, once every 2 months, and action the points that come out of that at the point that they occur, implement and revise and modify your policies accordingly so that they match the new frameworks that you are expected to comply with. Very, very important. The fifth and final part from a strategy that I'm going to talk about, I see we're just about out of time, is the emergence of AI. Now, something that we've spoken quite extensively with our customers and in previous Bytes and Bytes presentations is that one of the risks you face when it comes to data protection, in the past, you kind of relied on the fact that your user base didn't know they had access to data simply because they didn't know how to access it. They couldn't guess a URL, or they didn't know how to access a SQL Server to be able to get at the data. When you give them AI-based tools, that defense disappears. Your users now will very quickly realize they have access to information that they shouldn't have access to, and then you're relying on ethical or moral standards to determine or guide the next step in the process. And we all understand sometimes how that ends up. So the emergence of AI in our world is by far the most compelling reason for you to finally get your data protection and compliance regimen sorted. It is the most compelling reason that we can see right now, because it represents probably the biggest risk and threat in unprotected environments. So from my perspective, that is where I'm going to call it quits from a formal presentation perspective. And I think at this point, we can enter into a Q&A and deal with any questions that have arisen.
Thanks, Gary. That's spot on time. We normally try and finish these off in exactly 30 minutes, and then we leave about 15 minutes of time for Q&A. So that is spot on. Thank you. So if anyone in the room has any questions, please feel free to raise your virtual hand. Otherwise, just pop it into the chat. We'll read it from the chat as well, and we'll answer any questions that you guys have. And I think just to reiterate what Gary was saying there as well, like certainly what we've noticed in our discussions with many of our customers is that the advent of artificial intelligence is really raising the stakes around compliance, because there's a lot of businesses that don't really understand to what extent their compliance extends in their organization because it's never been breached. So people haven't found documentation that they shouldn't find. And a lot of that actually had to do with what Gary was referring to, is that if you don't know what you're looking for, it's very difficult to find it. Artificial intelligence definitely changes that game. I mean, there's a lot of stories coming out of, initially overseas, but even in South Africa now, in the deployment of artificial intelligence, where just natural language and your level of administrative access on your environment allows artificial intelligence to serve you anything that you want. Whether you should be able to or not is all dependent on compliance. And obviously, if the compliance isn't set up correctly, then it's a massive risk to an organization. So that really is, it's one of the things that I think a lot of businesses have realized, with artificial intelligence coming in, compliance has always been important, but now it's really getting to a point where there's nowhere to hide. You need your compliance in place. You need to be able to protect sensitive data and control access to, to information like that. I'm not sure if we've got any questions coming through yet, but Mel, I know that we had one or two from customers prior to the session. Do you want to ask those just to kick us off?
Sure. So this one is very specific to education, but I think it could apply to anyone who's got limited ICT knowledge. So how can Purview work in an education environment with, how can Purview work in an educational environment with teachers who have limited ICT knowledge?
That is a great question. We deal with a lot of educational institutions, so I'm familiar with the type of environment that's being asked. So when you're looking at educational, especially in the schools framework, your biggest protection mechanism there is what do they call student safety and by extension privacy information. So it's not necessarily IP per se, but it's about accessing private or enforcing privacy legislation. And that's where a tool like Purview comes along, and it will start to automatically classify data based on what it sees. And you can put a lot of these rules in place. Purview is very good, by the way, at picking up an ID number. And once it does that, any of the data in the set or in the document is automatically classified as private. And the policies that are attached to the classification will then automatically apply. That will remove the requirement of the user to do anything other than accept the classification that's presented to them. And there's no real ICT knowledge that's required to manage that. So I think Purview as a tool will actually be very effective in educational institutions because of the fact that you can automate a lot of the classification and policies that is required to make it effective. In commercial spaces, that changes completely because you might be required to adhere to certain policies or implement certain policies and classifications because you're a part of a statutory body or because you're a public sector client, or you need to manage an ISO, 27001 audit of some sort, or you're there's some sort of other standards body that's applying certain policies and classifications or rules that you need to be governed by. That becomes quite important. In the schools or educational framework, you're just dealing with private data more than anything else.
So Gary, just to clarify on that, built into Purview, there is sensitive data classification in it, which obviously helps the layman. Whereas, as you say, in business, there's going to be a lot of different classifications that it isn't going to automatically know. You need to input those, and it'll obviously search for sensitive documents that contain that information and separate it out for you to choose who can access it.
Yeah, we've dealt with some over the last few months alone. We've dealt with some really ambiguous and contradictory type environments, and I'm trying to remember the exact scenario, but there was one where if you see a specific chemical formula in a document somewhere, you can classify any chemical formulas. If you're a chemistry company that develops new recipes and you want to protect your IP, you can protect those documents as being private or restricted or top secret even, and make sure that they don't leave the organization, they can't be sent out. You can apply your sort of data loss protection mechanisms to those policies itself. But if it's a school textbook, you're expecting to see a chemistry formula there. You don't want those classified. You just want to make sure that those are available to the people that need them, and that could be the general public.
Right.
That's why it takes the effort to go through those classifications. They don't just apply them blanketly, and make sure that they are relevant and contextual to your specific circumstance.
Okay, great. Mel, do we have any other questions that came through?
Yeah, just one. What does Microsoft Purview replace?
So it doesn't replace anything per se, but it's become the new collection name for a lot of tools that used to exist before. So as I mentioned earlier, you used to have a thing called the risk and compliance portal. It was hosted on a SharePoint environment, but you could license it independently. That's now moved under the Purview brand and stable. You've got e-discovery and a bunch of connectors that are now part of that classification. There is a portal with a dashboard and a whole bunch of other tools that now reach out beyond just your standard framework that you used to have in the past. The standard framework was Exchange Online and SharePoint itself included OneDrive and any Teams-based document library. Now you're going way beyond that. There's even connectors for AWS that you can use to classify and to attach to data in other data centers.
Awesome. Great. Any other questions from the room? Any other comments? Hopefully, there we go. We've got one from Tennis.
Oh, thank you. It's been a good session so far. Just have a quick question because it's something I've asked others as well. When implementing Purview, now a lot can be achieved with a level 5 license like the A5. I'm just wondering how much is left over to using log analytics and things running in Azure. How much reliance do you have that you have to spend on that side as well?
I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to ask. Let me see if Luke is in the meeting. Are you here, Luke? Will you be able to give us an answer to that? I'm not sure. I know that Purview does require or rely on a lot of telemetry data that it gets from various sources, but I'm not sure if log analytics, I haven't specifically looked into that.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify that a bit. There's not really a requirement for log analytics, if I understood the question correctly. So with your licenses, all the data is pulling directly into the Purview portal and everything's connected via that way. You don't actually have to set up a log analytics repository to collect any data. I don't know, maybe if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yes, I think a big question is beyond the A5 license, how much extra cost can one expect would be incurred by the likes of storage in Azure?
So as long as you have the A5 licensing, you're implementing Purview is not there's no additional costs attached to it.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Tennis. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Luke.
It looks like someone else had a question, but I think it must have been answered already. So anyone else in the room with anything else to add? Or because if not, we are almost perfectly on time. Nice, short and sweet. So thank you, Gary, for the prezo and all the information. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weeks. Enjoy the coming weekend, and we will see you at the next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your lunch.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thanks. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.